Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video for the Fay Enchantress. Now, the Fay Enchantress is a legendary lord for Bretonnia. Her history dates back to around the founding of Bretonnia, if not many hundreds of years before. The Fay Enchantress has always been a known entity to the Bretonnian people, but for the most part they tended to avoid her. It wasn't till around the year of the imperial calendar 977, so about 1500 years before the current Warhammer timeline, that the people of Bretonnia started to interact in any kind of positive way with the Fay Enchantress. It started with the, not quite the conquest, but the uniting of the Bretonii, or Bretonnian people. Now, the Bretonnian people were descendants of an ancient tribe of people known as the Bretonii, and the Bretonii had been around since the age of Sigmar, and in the 1,000 years since the passing of Sigmar, they'd kind of formed into individual dukedoms, but they'd often be at war with each other, or just not necessarily cooperating in any way, not coming to one another's aid. And as such, Bretonnia, the whole lands of the western old world, had been under siege from orcs and goblins, greenskins, the beastmen, chaos, Norska, and even the undead from the Tomb King's front, from the land of the dead, had come up as well and started to cause problems within the lands that would become known as Bretonnia. Now, on their last legs, essentially, a chap who had become known as the founder of Bretonnia, called Guy le Breton, rose to prominence and started to put together an army to fight back. Now, at first, he essentially just got completely beaten, and this is when the Bretonnians are introduced to the person who they now worship as their goddess, the Lady of the Lake. She blessed Le Breton and a couple of his mates with the gift of the lady, essentially making them sort of super-powered humans with huge amounts of strength. They can slay 300, 400, 500 greenskins at a time without breaking a sweat. So they take these powers, take their armies, fight back against all these forces trying to destroy the humans of Bretonnia. And eventually, as they're sweeping towards the southern part of the kingdom that would become known as Bretonnia, Guy le Breton suddenly has a vision, and he's told to go to Quesnel. And for those of you who don't know, Quesnel, as you see here, is the province right next to Athel-Loren in the lands of Bretonnia. So Le Breton and his army march south to Quesnel. At that point, this is the area where many of his soldiers have heard of this deviant, this magical, dreaded, even described as the dreaded Fay Enchantress. And she lives within the woods of that area, but that's also where the Orc and Goblin army is hiding out, and they need to purge from the area. Now, I'm not sure what the Wood Elves were doing at this point, but maybe because it was just so close to the edge of the forest, they weren't particularly bothered about what was going on, or had made plans to kill the Orcs and Goblins, but were just happy to let the humans handle it if that's what they were marching in to do. But anyway, the Fay Enchantress is said to have lived within these woods, and within the history of the Wood Elves, as I understand it, they haven't necessarily had huge amounts of interaction with her, but she maybe just lives on the edge of the woods between the kingdoms of man and the Wood Elves. So they go in, they find all the Orcs and Goblins, they begin to engage in a battle, and suddenly bursting out of the undergrowth, the Fay Enchantress joins them, comes to their aid, starts raining down firebolts, lightning, all sorts of nefarious magics, and they just obliterate the Greenskin army. It is just decimated. They've won the day. And because Le Breton had been guided there by a vision, he knew that the Fay Enchantress had something to do with the lady, and indeed she is described as the sort of embodiment or the representative of the lady in semi-mortal form. I wouldn't say she's necessarily mortal, that's a bit of an open question, but she's essentially the head representative of the lady. If the Lady of the Lake is God, she's the Pope. That's essentially how it works. The Fay Enchantress then joins Le Breton as he continues on, rides at the head of the army with him and his newly formed Grail Knights, and they charge all over the new lands of Bretonnia, freeing it, essentially forming the Kingdom of Bretonnia. In fact, once they'd managed to chase out the forces of Chaos, who are the last outstanding faction who are non-human in Bretonnia, from, I think it was from the outskirts of Couronne, then the Fay Enchantress herself was the one to anoint Guy le Breton as the uniter and the first royarch of the Bretonnian Kingdom. If you'd like a bit more on that story, do check out my Green Knight lore video, and I go into a bit more detail of the campaign of Guy le Breton. There'll be an icon that's just popped up on the right-hand corner. Just click on that and it'll take take you to that video. But anyway, so since she is the representative of what the citizens of Bretonnia now consider their god, thanks to her helping them reclaim Bretonnia, unite as a single kingdom, have a fighting chance going forward to repel any beastmen or greenskins or undead or whoever else tries to have a pop at humanity from that side of the world. So as the representative of the lady, she starts to hold down some of the most prominent position within the kingdom. When soldiers go on to try and become Grail Knights, their oath to the lady is actually by proxy an oath to the Fay Enchantress herself, and as a result, all Grail Knights in Bretonnia owe their allegiance to the Fay Enchantress. So they will listen to her over king, over duke, over family, over anybody. The Fay Enchantress is their word, is the person who commands them to act over anyone else, irregardless of who they are, except for the lady herself. As a result, the Fay Enchantress has huge amounts of political power, as the kings of Bretonnia, as all the dukes of Bretonnia are oath sworn to obey her. If, for example, a king dies without an heir, it's in fact the Fay Enchantress who picks his successor. Alternatively, if she herself finds a king unworthy, because all Grail Knights are oath sworn to her and serve under her, she can in fact depose sitting kings of Bretonnia. This has only happened on one occasion, but it has happened. It happened to a king called Baluman the Brave, I think that's how you say his name. He essentially she found him to be an unworthy king, ordered her Grail Knights to take him away. They did. She named another king, and no sort of eyebrows, like no one tried to attack her or anything. That was regarded as being completely within her rights to do. So a hugely powerful person in the kingdom of Bretonnia. We're not dealing with the affairs of state and sitting in with the court of the king, as she does to this very day. The Fay Enchantress tends to wander the countryside, and what she's doing most of the time, no one really knows, but part of her activity is that she wanders the countryside and she collects boys and girls who have a talent in magic. Now she takes them, and now Bretonnians aren't really 100% sure what she does with them, but the theory is she takes them to amongst Bretonnians who, bear in mind, 90% of which probably can't read and have never seen anything more than a firework to regard as magic. But Bretonnians think that the Fay Enchantress takes them to the other world, as they describe it. Some of them return from the other world as damsels or prophetesses for the Bretonnian army, as their magic wielders, essentially. Now, these are only ever the women, bear in mind. She does take boys, but the boys are never heard of again. They disappear. They don't become the Grail Knights, none of that. No, they are just never heard from again and heavily suspected to have just been murdered by the Fay Enchantress. No one really knows, as I say. But, you know, people talk. She might be murdering boys. That essentially seems to be what she's doing most of the time when she's not in court, not serving at the side of the king, or not riding into battle with the armies to go to the aid of Bretonnia. The nature of the Fay Enchantress itself is rather mysterious. Some say she's mortal, and that every generation someone takes over the title. It's more of a position than a singular person. She's gone by many names over the years as well, which adds to this idea of it being a generational shift. However, because she rides a unicorn, many people think the only people who are able to do that are people who have otherworldly presence, who are not mortals, because they see the spell singers of the wood elves from time to time, once a century or something. They're like, ooh, magical. So she can't possibly be mortal because she rides a unicorn. So that's their theory, that many Bretonnians think she is the same Fay Enchantress who Le Breton met 1,500 years ago and had even been alive before then. Others suspect that it's just a generational shift and it's a sort of promotion system. Whichever damsel goes on to become a prophetess, and the best of the prophetesses go on to become the Fay Enchantress. Who can say? It's never really been answered within the world of Warhammer. Just one of those mysteries that indeed the Fay Enchantress is ever present in Bretonnia. Whether she's the same person or an immortal, no one's 100% sure. At the moment, her other name, her sort of worldly name as it were, is Morgana Lefay. Again, another Arthurian-inspired name, as many of you will recognize. In terms of her relationship with the lady, it's never really gone into in a huge amount of detail. We know that she serves the lady, she carries out the will of the lady, but in terms of their relationship before the founding of Bretonnia, there's not much that covers that. So I don't think it's a thing like with Ariel, the Queen of the Wood Elves, where she's the avatar of the lady. They're described as two very different entities. She's just more of an ambassador, but why the lady necessarily needs an ambassador, who's to say? That would play very much into the theory that she is mortal, and it is a generational shift, and the lady just needs a human to essentially be her vessel and to carry her message around, because she doesn't want to show herself off all the time to the Bretonnians. They get carried away and go into some sort of religious fervor. So looking at the lady and sort of what her rules were on the tabletop, at this point I'm just speculating, but many of you might see this video after the release of the Old World edition, where Bretonnia was included in the Total War Warhammer game. So forgive me if I get any of this wrong, but I'm just going off the rules of the tabletop at this point and making a kind of educated guess at what the Fay Enchantress might be like in the game. Now, as you see, the Fay Enchantress here is very much like the depiction of the Fay Enchantress that Total War Warhammer are looking at, but I just thought I'd give you guys a little bit of another picture to look at, because I've always liked this interpretation of the Fay Enchantress, kind of the crazy, accentuated medieval Arthurian hat, and just looking a bit more badass. That's kind of my preferred version of her. That's the older version that Games Workshop used to make a model for, with the sort of large hat and holding her gear there. So, sorry, as I was saying, speculating on the aspects of the lady. She has a few special rules on the tabletop. The first of which is that she has access to all 8 laws of magic. So those 8 laws being the law of light, the law of gold, or the law of metal as you may know it, the law of jade, stroke life, the celestial law of heavens, grey, stroke shadows, amethyst, stroke death, bright, stroke fire, burn, or amber, the law of beasts, with the amber spear and the summoning the manticore, all that fun stuff. So that has the potential to make her a hugely overpowered character in Total War Warhammer if you gave her access to all the spells of all those schools of magic. I see them doing what they did with the branch wraiths, which is kind of creating their own hybrid skill trees, and I think there'd be 2 different options of 2 different hybrid options they put together, maybe with a spell from each law in each branch that she can go in, but I can't imagine them giving her all the spells for all of those laws of magic. That would make her probably one of the most, if not the most powerful character in the game, definitely the most powerful magic user, legendary lord in the game. Put Balthazar, Gelt, and Kemmler to shame. Moving on from those 8 laws of magic, she also has a couple of other special rules. The supreme aura of the lady, because she's the lady's #1 gal, her prime ambassador, so she always has an extra special blessing from the lady. That essentially gives her magic resistance. The supreme aura of the lady also grants the Fay Enchantress fear-causing effects against the Skaven and the Greenskin, and terror-causing effects against the Beastmen of Chaos. She has the Favor of the Fae, which is her ability to buff a selected unit with, on the tabletop, +1 chance to hit on a dice throw. But on this, it would probably be a bonus to melee attack. That would be the most direct translation. They'll make it a buff to... It could be a buff to anything in the final product. So we'll have to wait and see for that one. The Blessing of the Lady, which is a rule on the tabletop, that because the special rule for Bretonnia was, now I never played Bretonnia, so forgive me if I get this wrong, guys, but I'm going to try and convey the general idea. But Bretonnia, if they didn't move or didn't attack, or there was something they couldn't do in their first turn of action on the tabletop game, they'd have to pray instead. And if they prayed, all their units got a buff of some kind. Now, she, being in an army, would allow that to happen automatically, and they wouldn't have to pray. So I think that would just be a general army buff. I'm not sure what it would be a buff to. Maybe a buff to stats, or maybe even a buff to speed. I mean, when I say stats, I meant melee attack, but or a buff to speed. But who knows? I mean, with Vlad, no one expected them to give him an army that could vanguard fully every single unit. So it could be something completely over the top, but we'll wait to see what that ends up being. Now, she also used to have access to a unit called the Grail Guardians, which were essentially a unit of Grail Knights she'd give a boost to by being in that unit. Now, I don't think we'll see the Grail Guardians until regiments of renown are made available for Bretonnia. I suspect the Grail Guardians will become a regiment of renown for Bretonnia, and that's when we'll see them, rather than seeing her being able to... Or maybe even as a banner, actually. We have seen Skarsnik and Grimgor be able to give their specialized units banners when they're in their armies. So we might see it as a banner to boost any regiment, but maybe specifically a regiment of Grail Knights. We'll have to wait and see that for that one. The next rule is, I quite like, because it's a little bit of a favorite of mine, is the Spiteful Glance. Now, I like the idea of this, because the idea is that the Fay Enchantress has such a resting bitch face that if she turns around and gives you the squinty eye, as it were, that would cause units to get a wound. Now, on the tabletop, what they'd have to do is take an initiative test, but I'm not sure how they'll translate that to the game itself. They could either do 2 things. I think it would either be a aura around her like the Mortis engine that deals damage, but I would say a much smaller radius, because it used to only apply to units that were in base-to-base contact with her model. So a really tight aura that conveys damage, or maybe just a leadership debuff if anyone's around her at a certain time. So the glance of the lady, giving you the evil eye, you get hurt. That's the way it goes. In terms of her gear and her mount is named Silveron. He on the tabletop was able to give her magic resistance and a ward save, and could give her a fairly punchy charge as well. I think she won't get the resistance and stuff from him, but he'll maybe have quite a punchy charge, but not be able to hang around in melee for too long, because obviously he's not very well armored. So maybe he charges in, can be a bit of a shock, cav in a pinch if you have no one else to charge in. He charges in, sticks his horn in someone, charges back out, job done, good boy Silveron, have an apple. So I think that's what he might end up doing. The chalice, the cup in her hand, in both these images actually, is the Chalice of Potions. Now what that does on the tabletop is it gives her, once per magic phase, so once per turn essentially, a ability to use a free celestial magic spell. And depending on what dice you rolled, you got a random one. I don't think they'll give you a random one in Total War Warhammer. What happened in Warhammer was if you rolled a 6, you'd actually end up casting the Comet of Cassandora and not be able to use the cup again, because the idea is she overdid it, used the most powerful spell in the lore of heavens, and then that was the end of the cup. I think in this, they might just give you Comet of Cassandora for free, maybe with a 1 use per battle, or on a really long cooldown. That's how I see the Chalice of Potions being one of her items in Total War Warhammer. The other item she has that you can kind of see her wearing better on the model that Total War Warhammer have already made is, well, it's not really a girdle, it's more like sort of chains of gold she wears around her, but it's meant to be a girdle of gold. And this essentially just gave her a reward save, so I think it'll do that, maybe provide some campaign bonuses to her as well when she eventually gets that item through a quest. And the last, but by no means least, and probably my favorite item of hers, which we haven't seen, is the Power Familiar Toad. Now the story is that this was once a powerful wizard who upset the Fay Enchantress, and ever since then she turned him into a toad and carries the toad around in her pocket. Now this guy would essentially, I think, give her either reduced cooldown for spells or increase the rate at which she recovers winds of magic. I think it'll be one of those two. It's essentially the frog on the tabletop boosts her magic by granting her an extra dice to cast spells or to dispel spells. So I think it's going to be a magic boost of one of those two things when she gets the frog. And I hope there's an animation when she pulls a frog out of a pocket. Please guys, please Creative Assembly, make that reality. I've only got 2 weeks to find out, but please let the Fay Enchantress pull a frog out of her pocket and use it to boost her magic spells. That would be hilarious. Let's go for it. And that about sums it up really, guys, for the Fay Enchantress. We have a couple of images on the Total War Warhammer Facebook page. You can look at them. Now, I'm a bit skeptical here. I'm not sure if this is maybe an early screenshot they took, but she doesn't seem to be carrying anything. Now, the Fay Enchantress does have her chalice, and she's almost always pictured with the chalice in her hand at the very least, and often with a sword. But the Fay Enchantress here doesn't seem to have either of those things. So I'm wondering, that might be a bit of a bummer if we don't get to see the chalice or the frog, which I mentioned earlier. She doesn't seem to be holding anything, just gonna sort of maybe whiz about like the spell singers or something. Yeah, so I'm not sure why she has nothing in her hands, but she looks good. As I said, I do prefer the Arthurian hat look, personally. She looks a bit more vicious. And I think the Fay Enchantress is meant to have this very dark side, but I suppose making her sort of this pretty, sleek blonde is maybe a bit more disarming, that she like murders children and stuff like that. There you go. This is what we've got. Looking forward to seeing her in the game. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Do check out my other Bretonnian Lords video on Alberic de Bordelot and the Green Knight, who are both likely to appear on the 28th of February, along with the Fay Enchantress. Thanks again for watching, guys. Do subscribe, leave a like if you enjoyed it. If I missed anything about the Fay Enchantress that you wish you'd seen, do drop it in the comments below. I always like to learn a bit more if I've missed anything. And just thanks again, guys. Thanks for watching and have a great day.